The next set of videos I'm going to have is going to be a two-part series showing you how to make first a torsion style assembly table that fits on top of your table saw. If you have a small shop like mine, mine's only 190 square feet, you end up doing a lot of assembly on top of whatever surfaces you have. And unfortunately in the past that has been my table saw top, and I don't always put down a protective covering, so the cast iron has gotten pretty messed up over the years. So I made this torsion box that sits on top of my table saw but can be removed when you want to use the saw. And that worked out great, but I quickly found that when you're gluing something up, obviously you can't use the saw. So the second video is going to be a series showing you how to turn that torsion style box into then an outfeed table that could slide on and off of your table saw as you please. Now for me, this is most likely going to spend a lot of its time off of the table saw in the outfeed section, because then you'll also have a much larger work surface to work with. But with both of the videos, you can either decide what you want and either make something that sits on top of your table saw that can be removed, or something that slides off of your table saw that can still be used as an assembly table, but also as an outfeed table. Now this design is going to be based on the dimensions of your saw top and your tile saw. So I kind of tried to go through all of the, like I had to add some dados on the back in order to fit the bolts that attach the rails to my saw. So you'll kind of see the process of that as you go. So this is going to be ripped down into two pieces, should be able to make all four of my sides for this one into 1-inch strips. And I went and bought the MDF that's made for shelves, so the front of it actually has a bull nose curve on it, which I obviously won't use. And that's just because it's a little less cost effective to buy it pieced out like this, but because my shop is so small, and MDF is really heavy, it's just so much easier to buy these chunked or get them cut up in the store and bring them back to my shop. My four sides cut, I put a little glue on each corner. I'm going to go around and attach them with just some brads and check for square on each corner. With my sides in place and squared up, now I can cut the innards for my webbing. And I'm going to put this together with lap joints. I've seen people put it together with butt joints. I never really prefer butt joints on anything, and with a simple jig I could go through and cut all my laps. And then I'll just know it's more secure. So for the piece I'm making next week for a customer, I'm doing a 5-inch grid increment. So I'm just going to do that for this one so I could use the jig I make for this on that one next week. So I marked out 5 this way and 5 that way, and it gave me 6 pieces and 8 pieces. So I could go through and rip down a piece of MDF and cut it into 6 strips, and then do the same for the 8 strips. So I'm using 1/2-inch MDF for my inner webbing. And I bought enough of it to make this and the other project, and I had this cut down in the store just to make my life 10 times easier at the shop. I sometimes prefer not to do that because the machines in those big box stores are not always super accurate, but it wasn't really super important if this line wasn't perfect for this project. So the length is going to be 46 5/16, and the width of this for the inner web is 34 7/16. So I marked both of these on my piece, and then I'm going to cut those 2 sections and then rip them down, and I'll have all of my pieces. In order to make the jig to cut these laps, I kind of modified a finger jointing jig. So I just had a scrap piece of wood that I attached to my miter gauge. I put my 1/2 inch dado stack in there, and the nice thing about MDF is a 1/2 inch is a 1/2 inch. It's not like plywood where it's like a fraction of a 1/2 inch and you have to use shims on your dado stack. So I have this straight up 1/2 inch dado stack in there, and then I ran it through and made a notch. From that notch I measured over 5 inches, which is the web spacing I'm making for this, and cut another notch. And then I used a piece of scrap MDF 1/2 inch, I glued it in that notch, and then brad nailed it in from the bottom. Now that I have my spacing, I can line this back up with the hole and reattach it to my gauge. So with that jig clamped back to my gauge, I should be able to take all of my pieces, line them up with that indexing pin, run them through, and then keep sliding them over. So with all of one size cut, I could do the exact same thing for the longer sides. I have all that webbing laid out and it fits in that box perfectly. And of course, you know, I have the 5 inch increments, and in the sides where there's excess it's a little bit shorter, but you don't have to do any of that math with the jig. So I rechecked everything for level and square, and now I'm going to go around and put a brad on each of these around the whole perimeter, and then put the top on and put brads in that through all these verticals and horizontals, as well as maybe a couple screws in there too. So now that I have that top tacked in place, and I cut this this is actually going to be the bottom. I cut the bottom a little bit large to allow for me to trim it. So I'm going to take a flush trim bit and go around the edges and trim this flush with the sides. So this torsion box is going to be held on the top of my table saw by 3 pieces of wood. One's going to go on this edge, and I'm not going to do that one just yet. And then another's going to fit in this groove, and then another one's going to be on the back side of the table saw. So I cut all of these. I used MDF for this one, so hopefully the size doesn't change. And this one was 5/8 by 2 3/4. And there's 2 bolts that hold the edge of this onto the table saw, and I made it so that it nestles right in between those bolts. And then this one on the edge could be really as wide as you want, because it could stick out as far as you want. And this was 2 1/4 inches, and that's going to sit just like that. Then I could put my torsion box on top and screw into these through the bottom. So I have the box set up on my table saw with the overhang that I want. Basically that overhang was just determined by the fact that I want the entire surface covered, so you can't see any of the rails or anything when the top's on. And you could see those pieces of wood that they fit perfectly on the back, as well as on the side there. So now I'm just going to measure, and from the top put some screws into those two and now with those two braces underneath, I'll be able to lift this up and slide it back down. And it doesn't move. So now that this is in place and I have my braces where I want them, I can attach the top the same way I attach the bottom. This box constructed, I can now put on the throwaway top on this. And for that, I'm using another piece of very thin MDF that someone gave to me. It was actually part of a pallet shipment that they didn't need. I did not measure this before. I thought it was a little bigger than it actually is. I didn't measure it before I started this, so it's actually a little short for my width. Now I'm not going to run to the store for this. I'm just going to trim it to length, which it's about 4 inches over, and then I might fill in this with something else and then put the outside frame on this. This is a throwaway top because the nice thing about this design is when you put the outside frame on, if this gets muckied up, dirtied up, you could just, it will be screwed on. You could take it off and switch it out, you know, every few months or every year, however often you use this. Now, since this table is mostly, I wanted something to protect my table saw top while I assembled things. With the throwaway top cut, I'm now going to trim out all the sides. And I'm not going to do anything fancy for this. This is not a fancy table. It's probably going to get dinged around quite a lot, actually, because I'm going to be taking it on and off pretty frequently. So one of the last projects I did, I was ripping up some 4x4s, and this is the leftover pieces, and it's just thick enough to make a nice edge. So I went through and I trimmed these up, and I'm just going to start attaching the two long sides and then cut and attach the width. And I'm just going to screw these on so that it's flush with my top. I've just been measuring and trimming and cutting these side pieces to fit all the way around, and I'm on the last piece, and because of the rails on my table saw, I just had to notch out the two edges so it would sit at the proper height. And now I could go and attach this one and then find some material to fill in this last little bit. For the back here, I had some stock 1/4 inch MDF that I just cut and filled in this back space, and now this throwaway piece can be screwed down. I'm going to screw it down from the top by countersinking the holes so the screws don't get in the way, and then if this ever gets beat, damaged, painted on, whatever, you can just take this cheap piece of cardboard off and replace it. So this is what that finished torsion box that I made for the top of my table saw looks like. I actually finished this probably like a month ago or so, but with the Christmas rush, I kind of put this project aside to focus on customer jobs. And right after I built it, I realized it wasn't going to be something I would utilize as much as I wanted to, mainly because even though it's a torsion box, it's still fairly heavy, so taking it on and off of my table saw is kind of a pain in the butt. And couple that with the fact that you can't use the saw obviously when you're assembling something on the table, and that wouldn't be a big problem, but I usually work on multiple jobs at once, so tying up my tabletop with the torsion box just wouldn't really work. So I've never had an outfield table in this shop because my shop is so small. I wouldn't be able to access other tools if I had a permanent outfield table. But as soon as I finished this, I kind of came up with this ideal of turning this into almost a liftable, slidable piece that could be put back on the table saw if I needed to use some of my other tools, but then could extend out with legs and be used as an outfeed table as well. So I have a little bit of free time now, and I think I'm going to start taking this apart and turning it into that and see how that goes. So one of the first things I'm going to have to do is take off these cleats I put on the bottom to keep it in place on the table saw. And I'm also going to end up taking out this patchwork section and making this a little bit smaller so that it will fit in my shop better. So if you want to make this torsion box for your table saw, you can use the first video and build it to your dimensions. If you kind of want to make the outfeed table I'm going to turn this into, obviously you would make it to the size you want, and you could skip this step of disassembling these parts to make that. I took the throwaway top off as well as all the sides, and I ended up having to hit that one cleat off because I screwed from the bottom in, and these are all glued, so this actual torsion box isn't coming apart. So the only thing I left to have to deal with is the other one, and luckily it's in a spot that I'm planning on cutting this down to fit into my shop a little bit better. And luckily I marked where all of my runs are on the top of this when I put the brad nails in it. So I can go through and I know where that end is, because you still want an end on it. You don't want to cut in the middle of one of these grids and then you have an open end. So I'm just going to go on my table saw and rip the edge off of this, and it will take this off as well. So you could see with that sliver cut off that I cut right through that one side almost perfectly. There's only about, what is that, a 1/16 of an inch was left. So that means that there's a good chunk of that spacer on the inside of the piece I have left. So this is what the inside looks like, and I have a nice piece left there, and now I could start rebuilding this. So if you wanted to build this design for your own table saw, this would probably be a good spot to start in the video, because obviously you won't be adjusting something that you made like I did.